And that's true of parenting, it's true of marriage, it's true of finances, it's true of your career. So for me, just having that growth mindset, that posture of, hey, wow, it's been great up to now. What do I need to do? How do I need to be different in this season is very helpful. And I
Hi,
think,
this is Garrett Sutton, and you're listening to the Average Joe Finances Podcast.
If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you smash the like and subscribe buttons. If you're listening to our podcast, go leave us a 5-star review. All of our links can be found in the video description or show notes below. Hey, welcome back to the Average Joe Finances Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Cavagioni, and today's guest is John Foong. So, John, super excited. It is actually tomorrow where we're talking to you from, right? We got this
welcome from the future.
Yeah. So back to the future over here. Hey, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike. It's a great honor to be here. You do a wonderful service for the global community on a very important topic. Thank you for involving me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And I appreciate you taking the time. I know it's pretty early in the morning the next day over there.
That's right.
Even though it's only about a 4-hour time difference, it's realistically about a 20-hour time difference if you go the right direction. But no, this is exciting. Always excited to talk to somebody on that side of the hemisphere. And so, John, I want to start this off by asking you, do the toilet bowls really flush in the opposite direction there?
It is true. It's true. I actually only learned that from the Simpsons episode that was about that.
Really?
This is, oh my goodness, 30 years ago. Yes, actually water does flow in a different direction in the Southern Hemisphere. So good day. And that's today's fun fact.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And you know, what's funny is I think this is like the first time that the first question I asked a guest wasn't the question that I always ask a guest that comes on. So let's make that the second question. And that's going to be, we'd like to know more about you, John. So could you share a little bit about yourself and share your story? Tell us, who is John Foong?
Oh, Mark, that is the question I think we all grapple with for our lives, but not to get too philosophical. Professionally, I lead sales at Domain, which is one of Australasia's largest real estate portals. So we help buyers and sellers, mums and dads, investors and renters sell their dream property. And we do a lot of work with real estate agents. That's my day job. I've done it for about 2 years and I love it. It's an amazing journey. Even though the market's been tough all around the world, it's so important to inspire confidence in people's property journey. That's my day job. And that comes on the back of about 15 years in the tech industry. So I was 13 years at Google, 2 years at Uber, most of that time in the US, half that time in Europe, even though I'm from Australia. So I've had the chance to really understand technology, portals, and marketplaces across a range of amazing companies. That's my professional story. On a personal note, I grew up here in Australia. My parents migrated from Malaysia and Hong Kong before I was born. And I had the chance to grow up here in Sydney. It's an amazing place. I grew up in Sydney. I actually did my undergraduate studies here, did my first job here, then spent the next 17 years overseas. And I just came back 2 years ago to be with my family here and bring my wife and kids along with me. And that's paralleled my investing journey. I had the chance to purchase my first house when I was 18. And that has been out of a culture of property investing. My dad was a real estate agent, but even before he was a real estate agent, he was an auditor in a bank. It was just tradition. As his father had done before him, as soon as you have income, you invest in property and you do shares on the side, stocks on the side. I can talk a lot more about that journey, but I've been chief revenue officer. That's my current job. A technologist. That's been my career. And throughout my life, a property investor with a lot of interest in stocks as well.
Yeah. So John, all interesting aspects of your life, especially when it comes to what this podcast is about. I'm curious now, with learning about some of those things in your background, what are some of the things, this can be a little bit different, but what are some of the things you learned at Google and maybe Uber, at least on the tech side, that you think helped you on your investing side?
That's a great question, Mike. I think what Google and Uber and those Silicon Valley tech companies, to make a broad generalization, I lived in Silicon Valley for over 10 years. So it was my life. I was at Stanford for a while. And that, I think what those companies have is deep paranoia. There is this
Okay,
notion,
that's
paranoia.
not something I was expecting to hear. Please tell me more.
I actually think it's one of those things that makes, again, I'll generalize, American technology companies so great and often so dominant is there is this belief of, okay, number one, in a positive way, how do we change the world? How do we change the world? What's it going to look like to make something? At Google, they called it the toothbrush test. Something so useful that everyone in the world uses it multiple times a day. That's great. That's positive. That's wonderful. And on the, I guess, the more cynical or negative or skeptical side, there is belief that somebody is going to come and disrupt us. Someone's going to come and disrupt us, right? There's some person in the garage, Mark Zuckerberg, Harvard dropout. He's going to build the next thing that's going to disrupt whatever it is, right? And those mindsets are very powerful and very useful. They can be a bit much if you get carried away with it. And so I think for me, what that's brought into my own investing is to play out both the best case and the worst case. The best case is, what does it look like to have a finance journey that I'm super proud of, that that my kids can benefit from, my grandkids, my great grandkids? What would that look like? How do you plan for the future? How do you plan for world domination? That's the mindset that you get, again, coming out of America, coming out of Silicon Valley. But at the same time, you play out the worst case. Like in this case, is not what will someone displace me as an investor. We're all investors here. But what does the worst case look like? And so for me, we used a lot of financial modeling, obviously, in technology companies about best case and worst case. And that's something over the last 10 years I've done a lot of. What is the best case scenario, and what could the net wealth of the family be? And what's the worst case scenario, and how might we mitigate that if those things were to occur?
Yeah, so that's interesting. That's one of the things that you took away from that. And I never really thought about that kind of mindset that these big tech companies would have. And that is a good way to think about it too, because when you become that big and you're creating something that is so useful to so many people, then that is the next question. Okay, who's going to be the person that comes in here and disrupts this? Who's going to be the person, who's going to be that company, Amazon? Who's going to be the Facebook, the college dropout that started this program, because Google was always like the number one, right? But before that, when I look at things too, I look back at the past, especially on the tech side. And I think about my childhood, right? And I think about when the AOL first came out and dial-up internet and all that stuff. And it was so exciting to get that "you've got mail" thing, right? Now it's
right.
Stop sending me emails, please.
Oh, totally.
But I look at that and I remember back to then, I'm just like, Yahoo was the thing. That was the place.
That's right.
But then Google came and disrupted, not only disrupted, but completely took over.
Yeah.
So it's pretty amazing to see that. Now, did you see the same type of mentality when you were at Uber as well?
Yeah, definitely. There is a quote by a guy called Andy Grove, who's the founder and CEO of Intel, which is "Only the paranoid survive." And I definitely see it, right? At Google and Uber. At Uber, when I was there a few years ago for 2 years. It was the thick of competition. There was Lyft that was coming and had a cool brand, and we're always looking at, hey, how's Lyft doing? What are they innovating? What can we learn from that? How can we one up them? And then, of course, there's a battle in each country, right? We're trying to expand into Asia, into India, and they had very strong domestic competitors. And then don't forget, at Uber, it's not just the rides, it's Uber Eats, and you have DoorDash, which is a delivery service. Wherever you look at it, even you might go, Google's number one search engine, but let's look at the lens of digital marketing. They're not number one there. Let's look at cloud computing. They're not number one there. You've got all these different spheres. You can always compete. You can always get better. And I think that's a very positive mindset. Again, if you take it too far, you'll never be at peace. But I think it's a wonderful thing to counter what Clayton Christensen calls the innovator's dilemma, the whole notion of why ultimately successful companies become unsuccessful. It's hard not to be complacent. So
I love that, John, because if you do take it too far, like you said, you're not gonna be able to sleep at night because you're just going to constantly be worried
around, going, oh my goodness,
constantly just worried about who's that next competitor that's going to show up and be knocking on our door. No, that's great. So now, learning that kind of mindset from the tech side, you said that you've been investing, your whole life, right? Ever since you were very young. And by learning this, do you find yourself to be a little bit more paranoid about when it comes to your investments? Or like, how does that translate into your personal financial journey?
Yeah, I think let's talk about mindset, because I think if I think about my own investing journey, it is the confluence of two mindsets that I try and find a balance between. And one of those mindsets is, how do we get better? How do we optimize with the cards that we've been dealt? How do we do the best possible things now based on what we know? So that's very much an optimizer, Silicon Valley, slightly paranoid, learning growth mindset. But at the same time, I try to have a mindset of, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. It may not be what you want, but it's going to be okay. And that's not just about finances. That's family, that's career, things like that. It may not be what you want, but it's going to be okay. And I think my investing journey is those two things. I'm always trying to understand, what do I need to change? Because the market's always changing, my personal circumstances are changing, what success looks like is changing. What got me to this stage won't get me to the next stage. So what am I going to do? And I want to have that mindset, always be learning. But at the same time, I want to be at peace, because it is going to be fine. I'm here in Australia. It's an amazing place. America is an amazing place. We're very fortunate that even if things are bad, they probably won't be that bad. And even if they're that bad, we're going to learn from it. We're going to learn from it. I guess if you asked me about how do I feel about my investing journey, I actually feel pretty at peace. I don't feel maybe as paranoid as I do at work. I feel like it's going to be okay. And I think part of that has been the own financial modeling to say, okay, like, what does okay look like? How much money do you survive? How much money do we need to put our kids through private schools or whatever our family goals are? Okay, do we have that? What's the buffer on top of that? And what adverse events might eat at that buffer? How likely is that? And what we defend against it? So in some ways, the mindset helps, but also see the raw numbers of, okay, here's the actual true situation. Here are some bad scenarios. It's unlikely to happen. I guess that does help as well.
Sure, to always have that, like, at least in the back of your mind, knowing what the possibilities are of things that may or may not occur. And I think to have a little bit, and I won't really call it paranoia, but maybe just to have some concern about the things
Yeah.
going around you, I think is super important, especially with what we just experienced over the last couple of years with this
Totally.
pandemic.
Almost.
Nobody saw that coming. And for people on the real estate side, like, we didn't know where anything was going. We had no idea how this was going to affect us, how it was going to affect home prices. You would think that something like that, you would think all the home prices were going to drop, but no, everyone had a scarcity mindset. So the home prices here in the States just skyrocketed over the next couple of years. It was insane. It was bonkers. It did the opposite of what a lot of people were calling for, right? So that goes to show that you never know what's going to happen. So you should always try
Yeah.
to be prepared for whatever
Yeah.
might come up. So again, not being paranoid, but being prepared.
Be prepared. That's good. Different P word.
Word, yeah.
Different P word. It actually, I reflect on the last 5 years. So our eldest daughter, we're like a 3 girls, which is beautiful and crazy.
I got 2.
Oh my goodness.
Yep.
No, it's an amazing gift. And obviously they're quite young. One is 5 months, one has just turned 3, the other one's 4.5. When my first one was born 4.5 years ago, I think when you become a father, everyone has a different experience. Mine was like this wonderful sense of awe and heightened sense of responsibility. Right? And so, oh, wow, okay, what are we going to do? What happens if the bad happens? Because before, it's me and my wife, and we're both working and we're going to be okay. And now you have this helpless dependent on you. What are you going to do? And I did find it very helpful at that point in time to do a family balance sheet. Right? To actually just go, okay, let's put it all on one Google sheet. Let's add it all together. What's our borrowings? What's our assets? And that was very helpful. And then number 2, what I did was actually start to build on top of that a profit and loss statement, which is, okay, based on what we're earning now, based on if my wife goes back to work part-time, or whatever the arrangement is, how much would net wealth grow or decline? So you get a balance sheet, and then you can time series that 5 years in advance is what we'll do next. And then I found it very helpful to run a bunch of, I guess in the corporate, what you call like penetration tests. Hey, what happens if, there's a stock market decline of 50%? What happens if there's a housing decline of 30%? What happens if I lose my job? What happens if she loses her job? What happens if we have a medical problem with the family, either ourselves, our parents, our child, that costs a few $100,000? And you run those tests against it. And I found that very helpful. And number one, because it almost brought a set of numbers to a unfathomable situation. So it brought data, it brought assumptions to something which is a scary black box, but it also gave us some assurance that actually we'd be okay. If this happened, we would sell this investment property. If this happened, we'd sell the stocks. If this happened, then if I didn't have to work for 2 years, here's how we'd handle it. We'd cut these expenses, we'd do that. So it just helped us be prepared. And we're grateful none of those things actually happened, but it helped us feel more assured about our situation, and also make some investment changes so that we were ready.
Yeah, John, I love that. That is phenomenal, because that goes along with the theme, like I said before, about being prepared. You built this family balance sheet, and you're able to use this to make sure, especially after having your first daughter, that you want to make sure that no matter what, you're going to be okay. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things I wrote down too, right? That part of your mindset is it's going to be okay. And why is it going to be okay? Because I've prepared for this, right? I've prepared for these different scenarios that might come up, right? And then the other thing you said too that I really love was the always be learning, right? Because I love that. Because for me, myself, I'm a content sponge. I am constantly listening to
that.
podcasts or watching YouTube videos that are helpful for me and my family, helpful to me when it comes to building my net worth and trying to just make sure that no matter what, when I look at the situations that could possibly come up, that it's going to be okay. So I love that theme that you went with here. Now, I want to talk about that too, about some of your assurances that you put in place to make sure that it's going to be okay. 4.5 years ago, had your first daughter. Then 3 years later, another year and a half after that, had your second. And then
right.
another 2.5 years after that, had another one. Having 3 daughters, and myself, I have 2 daughters. There's a lot of things as a father that go through your head that you want to make sure, especially for a daughter, when it comes to a father-daughter relationship, that you want to make sure that you're taking care of them and giving them what they need to grow and thrive in life.
That's
And
right.
when you look at these different scenarios that you put in place and the different things that can come up, and you have these assurances, what are some of these assurances that you put together to battle these what ifs?
Yeah, I think the best way to think about insurance to me was actually a series of wealth and cash flow, right? The balance sheet was very helpful to say, okay, how much are we worth? And then of that, how much you're worth, how much is in assets which are liquidable, which are liquid, and ones which aren't, right? Because yes, we have these houses. It's painful to sell a house. Part of my job is to make it less painful for customers in Australasia. It's a lot, right? And in a house, it takes there's no, I think one of your other guests said, there's no such thing as passive property investing. It's a
Right.
work. You pour your heart and soul into it. You really get the value when you hold it for a while. You get the tenant there, you get the house working, you get the cash flow working. So you got a bunch of things which are not very liquid. You got things which are quite illiquid. Your 401k, like yes, in theory you could touch that, but that's painful. You're going to pay a lot of tax if you do that. And you've got stuff which is actually very liquid. You might have stocks, you might have bonds, you might have a liquidity access line. And so a lot of it was actually compiling, here is our net wealth, and then here's how we break it down to categories. And then the next thing was look at our cash flow going, okay. And actually at one child, our cash flow was pretty good, right? Because actually, particularly before they're at school or things like that, they don't spend that much more money. You spend a bunch of time, a bunch of money buying things, though actually, particularly the Bay Area where we lived, a lot of people were really happy to share stuff and give things away. So we were very fortunate that we had all the stuff, that there weren't that many expenses, and it was just one kid, right, who didn't eat very much at the very beginning. And so we were able to go back at that.
Wait till she becomes a teenager. Trust me.
And a teenager bringing friends over. Oh my God, I can only imagine. We were able to go, okay, here's our net wealth. Here's the liquid amount, which is the buffer. Okay, how much is that liquid amount going up and down, which is our wages versus our increased expenses? And actually, we were still pretty cash flow positive at that point in time. So it's okay, great. If you play out the scenarios, if nothing happens that changes, right, we're pretty good. We're actually going to grow wealth. If something happens that where we have to spend a lot of money, we've got this much buffer. Okay, and if I lose my job or we want to move or something like that, then here's how many months we have before we need to correct the situation. And we looked at that and go, okay, that feels actually pretty good. Let's continue to invest and be leveraged and be aggressive with our investing. Now, 2 kids later, to 3 kids, we're now in Australia. We have a lot more expenses. My wife has not yet returned to work after our 3rd child. It's a very different cash flow situation, right? We're spending a lot more and we're earning less, and our expense profile is different. And so we just go through the same analysis, right? And we kind of think, okay, what's happening? And now we've gone from probably a net accrual rate to a net burn rate, which is fine. Different seasons, different things. We want to make sure we spend as much as we need to on childcare, particularly supporting my wife, that kind of stuff. That's a different posture, which is, okay, we've got this much in liquid assets. We're happy to spend this much. Our net deficit is this much every month, right, at this stage. And maybe that'll change. How many months before we need to have an event where we're running out of liquid assets or we're getting below a certain percentage? That's where you start to think, okay, do we need to change our spending profile? Do we need to actually convert some of those illiquid assets to liquid assets? So they're the conversations we're having with 3 young kids under 5 on 1 income.
Yeah, no, that's great to know, because there are a lot of different scenarios that can happen, right? You guys relocated from Silicon Valley back to Australia.
That's right.
Had 2 more kids. So it just changes the entire dynamic. Jobs shifted, income change. There's so many different factors that come into play. But the thing is, what do? You go back to that balance sheet, you reassess and you reevaluate. And from there, you build on to that plan to what's going to work for the family going forward from here. Before we had this excess, here's what's left over that we have left to invest in whatever we want. to now, okay, this is how much we could burn comfortably and keep this engine running while we're in transition or figuring out what the next move's going to be. So I
That's
think
right.
having some type of buffer is huge, because I know I recently experienced this myself when I transitioned out of the Navy and into the civilian world and being an entrepreneur and stuff. And I had this buffer, and I'm going on a year now of being home. And I'm actually getting ready to go back into a W-2 job because I got a really great offer,
Oh,
something
great.
that I don't want to
Congratulations.
say no to. And it's going to be phenomenal. But this year home that I had, I got to reflect on a lot of things. One thing that I noticed is that my wife and kids are not used to me being home. They're not. Two,
Quite a change. Quite a
that
change.
being said, having a teenage daughter, that really changes things, changes the dynamic. And she's always, are you always here? And a lot of time, one of the things that I've learned over this past year is I got to give a little bit more space now, because it was always I was always at work, always gone. And so time was so precious and got to cherish it. And now that I was home all the time, it's kind of okay, you got the time, just ease up on it a bit.
That's
So
right.
it's just, there's always seasons. Like, I like to use the word seasons. There's always these seasons in life, right? And as the seasons change, we have to change and adapt with it. Where I grew up in New York, we experienced all 4 seasons, right? In the summer, we would wear t-shirts and shorts. In the fall, it started to get a little more chilly. You'd have a hoodie or a light jacket on and maybe some jeans. In the winter, you had that large winter coat on, right?
Totally.
In the spring, back to maybe t-shirts, maybe a nice light long sleeve shirt, maybe some pants, whatever. But the point of that is, with the seasons that change, you also have to change and adapt to them, right? So with the weather, you would change what you would wear, things like that. So same thing with your finances, right? As the seasons of your life change, how you plan your finances, how you spend your money, how you have your relationship with money should also change with those seasons. So I think that's a fantastic point, John. Now,
Actually, Mike, can I
you
just make one comment on that?
sure, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Obviously, I think there is a book that it's a management book, but the title sticks with me. What got you here won't get you there. And it's a wonderful book. And I think it really describes life, really, that whether what got you to be a father won't get you to be a great father of young kids. And what you do as a father of young kids changes when your kids are teenagers. And that's true of parenting, it's true of marriage, it's true of finances, it's true of your career. So for me, just having that growth mindset, that posture of, hey, wow, it's been great up to now. What do I need to do? How do I need to be different in this season is very helpful. And I think
Yeah, I like
the
that.
underlying thing of all that, if I think through what has driven the extent to we're successful, our finance journey, it really actually comes down to, are you on the same page with your wife on finances, right?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
there's a book called The Speed of Trust. And the notion is that things move quickly when there is trust, when you're on the same page. And mistrust is like a tax. Everything moves more slowly if you don't trust the other party that you're collaborating with. I think one of the things I'm very grateful for is my wife has actually very similar investing history. Her parents invested in property when she was young and did the same thing as my parents and taught us very similar values about long-term investing, about prudence. That's helpful to have similar values, but actually so much of it, because everything's changing, we're changing. Are we on the same page? How do we resolve conflict? How do we look at opportunities? Is there trust? Is there clear roles? And I'm very grateful that me and my wife have had that. We're going to have to keep at it, not just with finances, but with parenting and with other things to do with marriage. But we're very grateful. And I think that's probably been the reason why these balance sheets and things have even worked. It's because there's that trust there.
Yeah, trust is huge. Absolutely love that. You got to be on the same page with your partner, right? Because if you guys are doing two different things, when it comes time to say, okay, let's see where we're at, there's going to be two different answers, two different stories, and it's not going to match up. And that's just leading into something far worse than, okay,
Totally.
our balances might be messed up. So no, definitely appreciate that. Now, John, what I wanted to ask you was about your real estate, right? So I
Yeah.
know you've owned properties both in the States and in Australia.
Right.
So I was curious to some of the differences you've experienced with owning property in Australia and owning property in the States, and what the differences are between how you purchase property in the United States, like with a mortgage and everything, versus how you purchase property in Australia. Because I do something myself called velocity banking, and it's very
Mm.
commonly referred to as the Australian mortgage on a home. So if
Huh.
you could describe that a little bit, like what the difference is between buying a property in the States versus buying a property in Australia,
Yeah. So it's
at
been,
least from the financing side.
yeah, the financial side, I think there's a few differences. I have had the privilege of investing in both, and I'm still investing in both. things that I'm grateful for in America, maybe I'll start with that. That's different. I'm grateful for 30-year mortgages, right? We don't have that in Australia. 30-year mortgages are amazing. They're a gift. I think they allow you to lock in, they allow you to de-risk over the course of a long period of time. In Australia, most, I'd say probably half of loans taken out have a fixed component and half don't. But the fixed component is only up to 5 years, and most people do 2 years. So you're on variable pretty quickly. And that really means that from a bank valuation point of view, they actually end up being able to loan you less money because they have to consider the worst case scenario of, okay, what if interest rates go up? And then that affects your ability to pay. So I think the American system that allows mortgages to be traded, which ultimately allows 30-year loans, is a great gift. That's number one. Number two, taxation. Taxation is treated very differently in the States. And I was in, most of my investments are in California, which is, from a taxation point of view, a very challenging place to invest, as you know. So tax in Australia is also fairly high. There's a lot of great social services here. There is not a federal and a state tax, just a federal tax, but it's similar to what the federal plus state tax would be in most places. It's actually probably more than most places, except California and New York. Australia has a lot of very helpful taxation regimes for property investing. So we have something called negative gearing, which means that you can write off any expense related to a property against any income, including your W-2. Right. So in America, it's categorized, right? So if you have property expenses, depreciation, it can be offset against property gains. That makes property investing very aggressive and very commonplace in Australia. So that's one thing which I think Australia is better. Australia is more helpful. The other thing is Australia has a very favorable tax treatment of your primary residence. So in America, you do have you have up to 500,000 deduction on capital gains if you for your primary residence. In Australia, there's no capital gains tax for your primary residence. Right. So as long as you're living in that house and you've lived in the past 6 years, so you might live in there for 20 years, it might quadruple in value and you pay no capital gains tax. So again, it means that your incentive is to buy, not to sell. And that we call that the great Australian dream. And it means that your incentive is to invest as much and to house hack your primary residence as possible. Again, there's some advantages in the US for that, nowhere near as much in Australia. The third thing about Australia and America that's different is buyer's agents are not very common in Australia. It's less than 10% of all transactions. And that's because it's not built into the commission system. So the seller's commission is built in and the seller pays that. It's about 2-3%, depending on where it is. There's no buyer's agent commission that's built in. And I'm a huge fan of buyer's agents. Buyer's agents were a huge gift to us, both when we were investing and when we were buying our primary residence. And I really like the fact that it's built into the commission structure in the US. It's just the norm. And a small percentage of people don't do it, but pretty much everyone does. I think that basically results in a much more educated buying and selling community, or buying community. There are still problems. There's still buyer's agents that don't do their job. And there are people that trust them too much. And there are situations which I don't like where the buyers and sellers agent are the same. And I think that results in conflict of interest. But as a result, in America, you generally have a much more informed buying community, much better about inspections, much better about things go wrong. In Australia, it's buyer beware, which means you may not know a lot of the problems. And if you do all the research, all those inspection reports are not made available as a default. And so I think that's a real positive for America, versus Australia.
Wow, that is a lot to digest, John, because some significant differences, really great takeaways about what makes it better in Australia and what makes it better in the United States. It's a mixed bag to where it feels like it's pretty even in neck. And actually, I want to share something with you too. So the buyer's agents out here, that actually it's the seller that actually pays the commission for both.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
It's pretty. We have a higher commission rate out here, and then pretty much the buyer and seller's agent split it.
And that to me is, I wish we had that in Australia, because obviously that's a historical legacy. If you tried to introduce it, we've got to pay 6 commission, 3 + 3 rather than just 3. Right. But because it's always been done there, that's the way it's accepted. And I think that results in good outcomes. Australia here, the buyer actually pays the buyer's agent. So we use one for a recent
which is why you have buyer beware. Right.
Well, I wish that the seller paid it, that everyone was in that habit, like it is in America, because everyone would have one and it'll be great. But here, because the buyer pays it, most buyers don't want to pay an extra 1.5%. Why would I pay an extra 1.5%? I'll just do it myself. And as a result, we really miss out on those things. So that's one of those big differences.
Right. Unless they've really gone out and studied real estate, maybe go out and take all the classes that a real estate agent would have to take. But it's interesting because, that representation you get with a buyer's agent is significant. So it's funny to hear the difference though between how that works in Australia versus in the States. So you've been able to experience both.
Yeah.
I want to rewind back to what I was talking about with the Australian mortgage, right? So that's what we call velocity banking, because you had described it as you'll get a set 5 years in an interest rate and then it becomes variable, right?
Usually 2 years.
Yeah, yeah. So
It's not good time.
that's for us when we take out a HELOC, we do the same thing, right? Like I took out a HELOC on my home. I locked in for 5 years on a specific interest rate, then it goes
Cool.
variable. But what I did is I took the equity from that home, the equity in that HELOC, and I started paying down my mortgage with it,
Fantastic.
right? And then I pay that line down and then pay down the mortgage some more. And then I increase the line. And it's just a way to pay down the home faster. And I've also used it to purchase more real estate. So now I have
Right.
this liquidity. I have this line of credit of liquidity that actually helps me get in and do what I need to do. It's also helped me with this transition out of the military to where I'm at now. Like I had a really big buffer to work with.
Fantastic.
So that's something else that's really great about that. But it's funny because like it's been described in the past as an Australian mortgage. So that's why I
Oh,
wanted
really?
to hear what it was like there. Yeah.
No, I think America, with regards to line of credit, there's definitely more financial products and there's more options. And
Yeah.
you describe what you do. It's, if that stuff didn't exist, you would not be able to invest as much as you are now. So it's a great gift to have those things. I would love to have more of that sophistication in Australia. So it's interesting that the Australian mortgage is termed that way because I'd love more American mortgages here.
No, it's great. And for my listeners here, I just want to point this out. You guys are hearing the difference right now between the Australian real estate market and the US real estate market and just buying properties in general and what some of these differences are and how in the States, there's so many more opportunities to get money for real estate, to get credit or whatever it might be to purchase more
Right.
real estate. We do have some really great programs and great ways of financing if you want to get creative to get into more real estate. So I just want to point that out.
Yeah, just on that note, we talked all about kind of this growth mindset before.
Yeah.
I Going back in the day, I never would have thought about lines of credit because to me, it's almost like, why would you do that? I associate it with kind of margin loans, which is like, oh, sure, it's high risk, high reward. You pay a higher interest rate, but if the market goes down, you're in trouble. And so I had a mindset up to only a few years ago that I generally don't use lines of credit. I have mortgages. I try and leverage up with mortgages, and that's it. And it's only through exposing myself to more products and podcasts where it's like, oh, actually, here's another option. And I went from thinking like I would never touch that stuff to realizing, wow, that's actually very useful in certain circumstances. And for us, when we were moving from America to Australia, we were looking to take out a loan here in Australia. We needed more liquidity and we didn't necessarily want to sell all the assets we had in America. Those lines of credit were very useful, liquidity access line in this case. And so I'm grateful for those products existing. And my only wish is that I had educated myself more earlier because maybe I would have made different choices with the information I had.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Liquidity is the name of the game. It can really make or break you in the future and just really help you scale a lot faster. So, John, this has been awesome. I got a lot of great information, a really awesome page of notes here. I want to transition this into something that we call the final round.
Yes.
Where I'm going to ask you the same 4 questions I ask everybody that comes on the show. And it gives us a better idea of how you are under a little bit of pressure, getting asked some tough questions. They're not so bad, though. They're really not that bad. But if you're ready to go, we'll get that party started.
All right, let's give it a shot.
Okay, John. All right. So the first question of the final round is, what's the biggest mistake you've ever made when it comes to your own finances, investing, real estate, or just business in general?
I think the phrase that I use a lot in my current job is don't try to time the market, maximize your time in market. Right. So I think I would say foolish. It's very difficult to know what will happen. You talked about COVID before. Who knows what the impact of COVID is? We thought COVID would be terrible for property. And it was for a few weeks. And then it was amazing for a year and a half. And now we have the opposite. And now it's going back. So don't attempt to time the market. I would attempt to spend as much time in the market as possible because I know that historically stocks and properties go up 5 to 7% year on year if you can wait that and you're buying good assets. So that's what I've done. I've stopped trying to time the market and I just say, look, here's the money I have. Here's how much I can borrow. Let me maximize how much and how long I'm in the market. Ideally buy and hold on for as long as I can.
Yeah, appreciate that. It's something that's said commonly on this podcast too. Is when we talk about real estate in general, we always say the best time to buy real estate was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. Right.
Exactly.
So just always thinking like that, you're gonna be okay. As you said earlier, it's going to be okay. So I love that. Okay. All right, John. So the next question, again, these questions all tie into each other. But what is something that you've learned that you wish you knew when you first got started?
I started my life as a consultant. I worked at McKinsey here in Australia for a few years. And I think in my head, consulting was always something that you do if you have a lot of money or if you're a corporation, but it wasn't something for average Joe, right?
Sure.
And certainly using an expensive consultant is not for average Joes, but on basically every area, I have begun or continued to try and get help. For example, I would have never spoken to someone about tax consulting. We have over the last few years, particularly as we've made international moves. I wish I'd done 10 years ago, because there are all these tax laws, potential things you can do, problems to avoid that someone who is in the industry who's done 100 times will tell you about. And you have no idea because you've never done it at this stage of your life. Similar with things such as property investing, right? There are experts there. We talked about buyers, agents before. And the question which I'd always have for you is, who is the expert on something that's important to you? Is there a way you could speak to them? And it may be expensive, whether it's finances or your health or your marriage or things like that, but certainly you can learn. And if anything, I wish that I had understood my ignorance on any given topic earlier in my life, and I had reached out to experts, not just friends who are very helpful, it's a good start, but often paid experts where I might pay a few $100s, but save a few $100,000.
Yeah, I love that. I've paid coaches in the past too myself. I think coaches and mentorship are huge to success in any industry that you want to be in, not just necessarily real estate, but anything that you're interested in. If you want to be successful in it, you see all these folks that are in sports, right? They have coaches doing it by themselves. There's always somebody there that's giving them tips and tricks to get better at that. And actually, speaking of tips and tricks, that's actually the next question, John. Do you have any tips or tricks that you would recommend to someone that is just getting started out today?
There's probably two that come to mind. I did talk about the balance sheet and profit and loss statement. I did my first one really when our first child was born. I found that very helpful. I found it helpful because it not just forced me to understand the true state of my finances, but it also helped me question, like, what's the purpose of my life? What are the goals that I have in this point in time? So I think that is very helpful. Just say, okay, it's a mirror. It's a mirror. And when you look in the mirror, you make observations. You might want to make changes. That's one thing. The other thing is just start it. I talked about time in the market rather than time in the market. I'm very grateful that at the age of 18, I started to buy my own property, right? And going through that, the process of, oh, wow, how do I choose a property? Who do I use? How much am I going to spend? What do I do with this cash flow? What are this? It confronts you with a bunch of questions that you can only learn in practice and not theory. So no matter where you're at, if you're at the very start of your investing journey, if you're at the very start of earning money, if you're in the new stage of your life, I would just say, try and do something. After you do your analysis on your balance sheet, try an investment, whether it's stocks or an ETF or property, you'll learn. And it won't even be the right thing you do the first time, but it'll make your second and third times much better.
Yeah, I love that, because if you start early enough, you start off with your balance sheet right away, you track your net worth, you can see where you're trending, right? If you're trending up or down, and you just you have a better way to figure out any changes you might need to make, any change in trajectory as you're going on your journey. And I think that's huge, right? And get started, just get started, take action, right? Those are phenomenal answers. I appreciate that. So John, the final question of the final round is different than the rest of them. It's opinion based, but it's, do you have a favorite business, investing, or real estate related book or podcast, or both?
Oh, so many. Like you, Mike, I love absorbing information. My favorite thing to do is what I can tell the kids is go out for a run, and I run very slowly and I listen to a bunch of podcasts. So, I think some of the most helpful podcasts I've had is there's one called the 20-Minute VC or 20 VC. It's primarily aimed at venture capitalists and entrepreneurs. I've actually found it very helpful. They have a bunch of really interesting guests. They had Simon Sinek the other day. They had Larry Summers. They've had a whole lot of people who know a lot about different things, but talk out in ways that help you understand what's happening with the economy. And I think one of the things I've enjoyed out investing is, that you have a personal investing story, a house, a stock that you're doing, but it's part of a macro story that's happening. On the specific investing side, there's a podcast, Mad Money. So Jim Cramer's show is just translated into a podcast. I find the first few minutes of that very helpful each day because basically he describes what happened in the market and why. And sometimes you look, the market goes up, what's going on there? So I found that very helpful. And there's an organization called the Motley Fool that do a lot of stock picks.
Oh yeah, I'm on their email list. I get those all the time.
Yeah, and they're really interesting. They had an interesting philosophy of investing, which is worth considering, critiquing. They have a bunch of different podcasts each day. And I found them very helpful because it's not even so much, hey, here are the stocks to buy, go for it. I mean, that's somewhat helpful and sometimes right, sometimes wrong. Really important thing is they tell you about the philosophy about how you might think about growth versus defense. They try and relate some of those macroeconomic factors into what you might buy and sell. Because really, it is about making good decisions, but it's about teaching yourself how to make decisions. And that's why I've really enjoyed those particular podcasts.
Yeah, no, I love it. Thank you so much for those. I wrote them down. I'm going to go check those out. And yeah, I also like to listen to podcasts anytime I'm commuting anywhere or if I'm working out. My kids hate it because every time they get in the car, they're like, "Dad, put on music. We don't want to hear anybody talking anymore." So, but yeah, so John, this was awesome. So
Thanks, Mike.
that is it for the final round. However,
Right.
I have another question I want to ask you because of the conversations that we've been having, which were phenomenal. There's people in the audience that are going to say, "Hey, I want to know where I could find out more information about John and what you're doing and everything." Do you have a
Yeah, yeah.
website you could share with us or any social media profiles people can follow and track you down?
Yeah, I'm a big LinkedIn nerd. I love LinkedIn. There's a phrase that one of my colleagues said to me years ago, which is your network is your net worth.
Oh, it's
Uh,
so cheesy, but it's so true.
So cheesy, so cheesy. And network is a few things, right? It's people who you know directly. It's people who, and you might just contact them in certain situations. And there's people who you don't even know, but you learn from them. And I find LinkedIn a very efficient way to address all three. If those are listeners out there, particularly if you're in the property industry, where that's my day job, I'm very interested in connecting on LinkedIn. If you're creative content, please let me know. I'd love to follow you and learn from you. But yeah, LinkedIn is great. And that's actually my news feed. It used to be Facebook, used to be Instagram. Now my news feed is when I have time, I just look to LinkedIn and what are my friends at network doing and what can I learn from them? So please connect with me on there. It's John, John, Fung, Foong. And I work for a company called domain.com.au. We're a property portal in Australia, but that's how to find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Fantastic. So I'll make sure we have that in the show notes to make it easy for people to just copy and paste or click away and follow you. I'm just asking all my listeners, don't do it if you're driving, please. Wait till you
Please
get
don't do
somewhere
it driving.
safe.
Yes, not
So,
safe.
John, this has been phenomenal. I want to thank you again so much for taking the time out of your day tomorrow to have this conversation with me. I really appreciate it.
It's right. The future is bright. I can say that coming from the future. Now, seriously, thank you, Mike, and thank you for a great service that you have made. Number one, service to the world and America through the decades you spent there. But you play an equally important service now in helping people get through this difficult stuff, which is the stuff of life and marriages and those things. So it was wonderful to get to know you and your podcast. Thanks for what you're doing out there.
Yeah, John, thank you so much for that. And the future is bright, and I can't wait to get to tomorrow where you're at. Again, thank you. And I also want to say thank you to all of my listeners. Thank you so much for joining me and our special guest, John Foong, on the Average Joe Finances podcast. Go leave us a 5-star review and tell us what you liked about today's episode with John. Aloha from Hawaii and have a great rest of your day. Thank you for making it to the end of this episode. Greatly appreciate you being here with me today on the Average Joe Finances podcast. If you haven't done so yet, make this the episode that you go leave us a 5-star rating or subscribe to our YouTube channel. The Average Joe Finances podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Have an outstanding day.